And as we often do on this program, we are going to start with a daily distraction. We seem to be going with a space theme, which does fit our logo and does fit the name of the show, Liberty Starship. But this time, I'm not going to talk directly about SpaceX. Instead, I'm actually going to talk about one of their competitors and some news that they recently made. So this is an ad from the Reuters news service. It says Rocket Lab vehicle fails to reach orbit, loses payload of satellites. It says a rocket from small satellite launch firm Rocket Lab failed to reach orbit minutes after a successful liftoff from New Zealand on Saturday, the company said, losing its payload of 7 small satellites it intended to carry to space. An issue was experienced today during Rocket Lab's launch that caused the loss of the vehicle, the company said on Twitter, adding more information will be shared as available. We are deeply sorry to the customers on board Electron, the Auckland, New Zealand based company said. The issue occurred late in the flight during the second stage burn. Rocket Lab is one of a growing group of launch companies looking to slash the cost of sending shoebox-sized satellites to low Earth orbit, building smaller rockets and reinventing traditional production lines to meet a growing payload demand. Said the rocket's altitude peaked at 121 miles, roughly 7 minutes after liftoff before quickly decreasing, according to in-flight telemetry on the company's live video feed. It was aiming to send 5 tiny Earth imaging satellites from Planet Labs, 1 microsatellite from Canon Electronics, and a CubeSat from British company In Space Missions into sun synchronous orbit 310 miles above Earth. So, Pete, this is the first time I have actually heard of this company called Rocket Lab. I was not familiar with it. Had you heard of this company before?
No, I've heard of SpaceX and I've heard of Virgin Galactic, but this one is a new one for me.
Yeah, I actually had not heard of them either. I did see a article previously about another competitor in Japan a couple weeks ago that also had a failed launch. So it's interesting from the perspective that it seems to be that we're seeing more and more private companies that are sort of getting into this private space race. And I haven't really seen a lot of coverage of that termed that way. But it does seem to me that there's a lot of private companies out there right now that are trying to emulate the success of SpaceX and are trying to sort of do their own thing. Like this particular company, it sounds like they're putting very, very small rockets into orbit, or at least they're trying to, because apparently they failed in this attempt. And to be fair, SpaceX has failed in some of their attempts as well. But of course, they have I think, a fairly impressive track record at this point, especially with the big benchmark of recently putting some American astronauts into space aboard the International Space Station. But that mission actually isn't over yet. We still haven't had those astronauts return. But it'll be interesting to see the future of these companies as they start to get better and they start to become more competitive to SpaceX and what we might see in terms of the privatization of space and of space exploration.
This company is about 14 years old. So it's not like this is brand new, which was kind of what I expected since we haven't heard of it before. I thought we'd find that it was just funded a few years ago and this was their first launch. Um, does it mention their track record of attempting to get to space before this?
I don't believe this particular article gets into a lot of their. No, it doesn't actually. In fact, there's only one more paragraph to what I actually read. It's a very brief article just to chronicle the failure of this particular launch. Uh, but to kind of dovetail on your point, I remember even as a kid, there were some companies that were experimenting with putting very small satellites into Earth orbit. That was something that was already happening, and we're talking 30 years ago, something like that. So yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously, this isn't a new thing, but I think it is gaining a lot more prominence because of the success of SpaceX, also with their Starlink project, because they are putting a lot of small satellites into orbit now.
That's interesting. So they're thinking that they'll be more successful if they take it in smaller pieces rather than more bigger, more spectacular projects.
Right. This particular launch, they said that it's shoebox size satellites. They're very small. They're like considered. I think they call them microsatellites. Actually, they're very very small.
Wow, it's hard to
So
believe that something that small could even be stable, like it'd be able to power itself. That's just crazy.
it is, isn't
Uh,
it? And that's kind of
yeah.
the age that we're living in now.
Wow. That is amazing.